Yes. This is very interesting because there's quite a difference between how these accounts in the Vedas have been treated in India with how accounts of ancient technology have been treated in the Bible. And in my research, I've found lots of references to flying technology and interstellar technology in the Bible. But through the centuries before flight and our journeys into space, the translators tried to translate them as spiritual phenomena and didn't look on them as technology. Whereas with the Vedas, it's always been understood this was the flying technology of the gods, but it was disbelieved. When I went to India, I didn't know anything about the Vedas, but I could see the carvings on the buildings, and I could see things that looked like turbines, that looked like jet engines, that looked like rockets, that looked like aircraft. And so I was full of questions as a young boy traveling around India. Now I've seen more than that. I've seen tablets that look like iPads or iPhones, medical devices, guns, bombs. When you ask the mainstream commentators about these devices now that we have this technology, is there more openness to the idea that the Vedas are describing real historical experiences and that these carvings are portraying things that were real material science in the deep past?
There's going to be a lot of reluctance and resistance from mainstream historians and archaeologists. Understandably so, right? Because they have studied their own materials and they had to get all their degrees and their masters and their doctorates reading the materials, right? Saying repeatedly, pounding into their heads, saying that, okay, so these temples were built with primitive technology, these things did not exist, human beings evolved from apes, it was a very slow transition, we were all like primitive people until like 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So they've studied that from high school all the way up to their PhDs. And if they had to change their minds, I mean, what would happen to their jobs? So there's going to be a lot of resistance from them. We do see them, which is why I always take extra pains to, show the evidence as it is. There's still a lot of resistance, even when we show them, okay, so there is a carving that's holding something like a cell phone to its ear, right? So people, it's just there, whether you like it or not. That carving is still there in a 1,000-year-old temple. So, but people find it very hard to accept it because the evidence is right in your face. We don't know 100% if it's a cell phone, but that carving is there. Rather than accepting it that the statue exists, people try to discredit you, right? And I'm sure you face your own group of people who try to discredit you, because when we put out evidence that goes against centuries of established institution type stuff, we're going to get a lot of people who are upset. This is just the name of the game. But it's our duty to show the evidence.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm going to come back to rituals in temples a little later, but before we get there, I just wanted to ask if you could give us a survey of some of the sort of anomalies that you can find in terms of out-of-place
artifacts?
Technology. Yeah, out-of-place technology portrayed in temples. And you can find it all around the world, but I'm particularly interested in what you found in India.
Okay. So we have a particular type of artifacts called oop art. These are called out-of-place artifacts. The classic example of this is the Antikythera mechanism, where they found a weird mechanism, but it's much, much older. That kind of a gear mechanism is not supposed to exist like 2,000, 5,000 years ago. But they found it. So, but in India, we also find these out-of-place carvings. For example, in Hoysaleswara temple, which is a 850-year-old temple, you have a person holding up a telescope to one eye, closing the other eye, and looking at the sky. Such a carving is not supposed to exist because the telescope was invented much later than, when the temple was built. It was, the telescope was invented by Lippershey and Galileo much later. So we are not supposed to find carvings of a telescope. And then in Konark Sun Temple, you have a carving of a giraffe. And we see a bunch of people hanging out with the giraffe. And giraffes are only found in Africa. And we're not even talking about North Africa like Egypt or something like that. We're talking about deep down in the south. So, but we do find carvings of the giraffe in India. So we have evidence of advanced civilizations around the world which are somehow connected, and we're not able to put them together. In Hoysala Temple, you have a carving of an Egyptian. Looks very much like an Egyptian. In another temple called the Brihadiswara Temple, you have a carving of a European, with a top hat. So all these evidences prove that, we're not fully understanding these things, and these don't fit into the traditional history books, and these are all out of place artifacts. But the most important part about the technology is that we have evidence of these vimanas or flying machines. We do see that they have these vimanas carved in ancient temples. Now, what does a vimana mean? Right? A vimana is a flying machine very similar to an airplane. Okay? And then there is also another vimana which is very similar to a rocket or like a thing for space travel. Those are also called vimanas. The most popular one, which all Indians know about, is called a Pushpaka Vimana. This is mentioned in the ancient text called Ramayana, which is more than 2,000 years ago. And it clearly says that, there is a person who takes another person from India and he takes that person to Sri Lanka. Okay, this is through flight. So they're basically flying in air. And they even mention how they contact a bird in between when they fly. So this is very similar to how we travel to Sri Lanka. For example, I can travel from India to Sri Lanka in an hour. Like I would just go to the airport, take a flight and go there. So this kind of technology is mentioned clearly in ancient texts. And you can see them carved in ancient Indian temples. So you can actually see these carvings which look like a small aircraft. Looks very much like a microlight or an ultralight people fly today, and they're shown with wings. Sometimes they're shown with like strange accessories attached to them. Okay, so we can see evidence of these flying machines, and it's really interesting how our perspective is slowly changing, because just 100 years ago, before the Wright brothers came in, people used to think that this is absolute nonsense, right? This is pure fantasy. How can something that's heavier than air fly in air, right? So people, especially Westerners who studied the Vimana and translated them into English, they said this was pure fiction. There's no such technology. This is all coming out of pure imagination. And in the last 100 years, people have started to question, is it possible that they had this kind of technology thousands of years ago? Now, there's one more type of vimana mentioned in ancient Indian texts, and this is even better, right? Because they're talking about interstellar travel. The texts often mention how the gods come from the sky using vimanas. And just to decades ago, right? 20 years ago, before Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos started thinking about going to Mars and terraforming that place and start to colonize Mars for us to go and live there, people again thought this is just complete fiction. They just couldn't imagine that. But today, Elon Musk is planning to go to Mars. He's going to alter the surface of Mars. He's going to alter the atmosphere, right? For making it usable by humans, right? This is called terraforming, right? But the same technology is mentioned in ancient Indian texts. In Ramayana, there is a person called Trishanku, okay? So for this person, there were some people who went to another planet and created that planet suitable for him to go there and live. And again, the text mentions that they went in a golden vimana to that planet. So they were not only talking about the flying vimanas and interstellar travel, but they were also talking about these advanced concepts like terraforming. The ancient texts of India talk about very advanced technology. They talk about flying machines or vimanas. They talk about test tube babies. They talk about genetic engineering. They talk about interstellar travel. We do have some strong evidence that Nagas were these reptilian beings, very powerful, and they're able to do things like shape-shifting, for example. They're able to transform and create illusions. They're capable of flight, and they usually live underground.
Praveen Mohan is known worldwide for his research into the symbology of ancient temples around the world. His archaeological and spiritual quest has taken him to Peru, Indonesia, but focuses chiefly on the ancient treasures to be found in India. He has guested on History Channel's Ancient Aliens and has built his own platform to some 4 million subscribers across 4 languages. Praveen Mohan, welcome to The Fifth Kind.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you with us today. I love your documentaries, and it's a real treat to be shown around places that most people will never get the opportunity of visiting. I was very fortunate to visit India some years ago and explore some of the temples, but you take us to some very interesting places. And on those journeys, you found suggestions of ancient technology, healing therapies, ancient knowledge of medicine, genetics, possible contact with other species, and hints of international and global culture from the deep past that seems to throw a question mark over what we think we know about history. We're going to touch on all of those things in our conversation today, but I thought it'd be interesting to start by asking you, what got you started? What was the thing that drew you into this fascinating field?
Well, the thing is, I had a very unique childhood. When I was a child, I grew up around temples, not just one temple. I grew up in multiple temples. So it was really a unique experience because I was 10 years old and I would be inside the temple for more than 6 hours every day. And I used to look at all the idols and statues. And the Hindu temples in India, they have hundreds of stone statues. So I would look at the statues, I would try to understand why they are carved in a certain way. And I distinctly remember one time there was a giant granite pillar lying on the floor. And it had an unfinished carving. It was a lingam and it was an unfinished carving. And I was only about 10 years old, so I thought I would go and finish the carving myself. So the next day I went back to the temple with an iron nail, thinking that I could just somehow finish the carving. And I realized I couldn't do it. The next day I went with a screwdriver, hoping that, I could somehow use it as a chisel. And I realized that didn't do it either. So after trying for about 2 weeks, I I convinced myself it's not because I couldn't do it. It's because of the fact that the pillar was on the floor, right? So I thought maybe if I could put it up erect, I could finish the carving. So I couldn't move the pillar. After trying, I gave up. So I went back to school. I got a bunch of my friends who were all 10-year-olds. And then we tried to basically prop the pillar up erect. And we realized how heavy it was. And as a young boy, I realized that so what appears to be so simple is actually extremely complex. I'm not able to carve anything on this granite pillar because granite is a very hard material. It's one of the hardest rocks in the world. And we also realized that if 10 boys could not move this pillar must be weighing in tons. It's not in kilograms or pounds. This pillar is weighing in tons. And then we started wondering, how did ancient builders cut these rocks from the quarries? How did they move these pillars to the temple site? And how did they carve on these granite rocks, right? It's not really that simple. And what we read in history books is that, okay, so people were using really primitive tools. They didn't even have hardened steel at that time, like the steel I was using, like the screwdriver I was using. So how did they carve these amazing things into these pillars? And how did they move these tons and tons of rocks? So I got exposed to this kind of idea very, very early in my childhood. And obviously that must have been sleeping inside for a very long time. And then maybe when I was like 25, it just, something woke up that beast and I started to look at it again.
When you show evidence like that, say the person using what looks like a cell phone, what's the usual response? Do the mainstream experts say it looks like that, but it's something else? Do they say it's just imaginary technology? Do they tell you you're not seeing what you're seeing? What's the general approach?
We've seen a lot of different types of responses. In India, the responses tend to be more about your character rather than what the evidence is. It'd be simply like, oh, okay, Paul Wallace is not a good person, type of stuff, rather than saying, okay, what he's showing is not right. So this is still the mentality in India. One great thing is that there are some people who look at the evidence and see it as evidence. We do still have at least like 1/3 of the population who look at that evidence. If a person is holding something like a telescope to his eye and closing the other eye and looking at the sky, what else could it be?
Yes.
Right?
You have the advantage. Sorry, go on.
So we have about 1/3 of the people who actually say, okay, so this is real solid evidence. So it is possible that something like a telescope existed 900 years ago. That's the logical conclusion. But there's still like more than 50% of the people who, because see, it challenges what they've read for the last 25 to 50 years. That evidence is in your face, challenging whatever the ideas you have accumulated, right? So because it's very hard to face that kind of evidence because we all have confirmation bias. We'll just immediately switch over. You will either change the video because if you do face that evidence, if you do face that reality, then you have to change your own reality, which you have built for such a long time.
You're absolutely right, Praveen. And I think it really is the role of the writer or the documentary maker to push the conversation forward, because peer review will always keep people conservative. if people want to keep their tenure, they're not going to be the ones bringing the radical new ideas, but at least the academics can discuss what this crazy Praveen Mohan has said or this crazy Paul Wallace has said, and then you can move the conversation a little bit. But at least with the examples of the carved heritage that you look at, you've got a lot of support for what those things are in texts. So you have ancient texts that talk about flying craft. You have ancient texts that talk about gestation pods or terraforming, so that when you come to the carvings, it's not something you've just plucked out of the air to say, oh, this looks like that. You are saying this looks like what we have described in the texts. And in modern language, we would call it this. We would call it in vitro fertilization. We would call this a gestation pod. We would call this a flying craft, whatever it is. We would call this a surgical procedure. So there is that support there that should make it easier for some to come into the conversation and then ask the next question, was it real?
It's very interesting. I mean, I think I had a very interesting childhood.
So at the age of 25, did you already know that there were these anomalous pieces of advanced information about interstellar travel, time travel, or was 25 the beginning of your journey to discovering that there were all these treasures?
When I was 25, I was in the United States. I was, at 25, I think I was in Boston at that time. And I actually started to travel a lot. Initially, I traveled to, the fun places. I would probably go to like Cancun in Mexico and spend a weekend there partying. But later on, I started to go to the Mayan pyramids of Mexico and I started to look at the structures. And then I went to Peru and I went to places like Machu Picchu and Ollantaytambo. And then I started to connect that with my childhood ideas and realize that, okay, this is a global phenomenon, right? We don't have these giant megalithic structures only in India. We also have them in Mexico. We also have them in Peru. We definitely have them in Egypt. So I started to put these things together and realize that, okay, so there is something that we are not addressing here. We don't understand that fully. And it's all around the world. So when I was in the US until 2015, I focused more on South America and Central America. I looked at all those structures and we have these giant mounds in the United States. So I did some documentaries about the Serpent Mound and the Alligator Mound and things like that. But then as I started to delve deeper and deeper into these ancient sites, I realized that no, in order for me to crack this code, I have to come back to India. Because the most important detail, and I don't know if you know this, is that all the Greeks are not worshipping Thor or Hercules anymore. The Egyptians are not worshipping Ra, right? Those gods are all gone. I mean, they become superheroes sometimes in the modern day movies. But in India, we have 1 billion people who are still worshipping the same gods. And so we have the continuity. So when we go to Greece or when we go to Egypt, we can't ask the locals, what does this mean? What does this god mean? What kind of rituals are associated with the statue? Because that tradition is gone. But in India, we still have these temples and all the locals go to these temples and still do certain type of ritual for certain gods. So I realized that if I come back to India, I could not only research the temples, I could also understand what these statues mean and how these locals have these stories connected to them.